topic under discussion. Thank you very much, and I hope we all enjoy the session. Thank you, Dr. Kitty.
Thank you. Please let me confirm that you can see my slides without any extraneous matters. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see the title page.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, as our moderator said, I'm Kitty Ferguson. I'm Professor Emerita from Biola University in Southern California. And I originally did this presentation in Portland, and I have adapted it for you. So I hope you can see that reflected. So I developed this presentation because sometimes we have very old textbooks or traditional textbooks, but we also have a mandate to develop our students' oral skills. And sometimes we have textbooks that are really difficult for our students, or if not for all of our students, for many of our students. Sometimes we have students who are reluctant to speak, and yet again, we have, as part of our course goals, students developing their oral English. And sometimes we have students who are really eager to speak and participate well, but they need to be more accurate in their English. But to be honest, even if you have really great students and excellent textbooks, I hope the activities that I'm going to show you are still something that you can use. Okay, let me pause and ask the moderator if I need to change anything. We're doing okay?
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So I've chosen examples from these two textbooks. The first is for primary grades, the second one for secondary. And I found them in Tajikistan, but they are typical of books that I've seen in many parts of the world. I'll be describing 5 types of activities: dialogues, chants, choral drills, and card-cued pair work, change the ending, and reader's theater. So, what are the characteristics of these activities that make them something I want to share with you and something you might want to pay attention to? First of all, they provide scaffolding for student speech. That is, they help the students get up to the next level of their English. They're a bit challenging, but not too difficult. They lead to actual learning. Secondly, they help students with both accuracy and fluency. Our students will speak with fewer mistakes, and they'll also speak with more ease. Thirdly, they can be personalized for our students. We can use our student names, our local places, items of interest that are really current. And we can add a bit of humor and fun. I think that's really important to engage and motivate our students. These activities can be part of our repertoire as teachers, as I said, no matter what kind of textbook or students we have. You know, research into memory tells us that we remember things that we repeat and practice. Sometimes we don't get enough repetition and practice, and we want to make sure that our practice is meaningful. It touches our students' emotions. It may have a bit of a surprise and bring in something new, because research into memory also tells us that those characteristics help things stick in our mind. So, dialogues. You know what? Many textbooks have dialogues. Here's an example one from our sample. Now, the dialogue in the book is 4 lines, but I've chosen for my class activity to include only 2 lines. And that's an important adaptation you can do with anything in your textbook. Just make it simpler. Now, when I introduce the dialogue, I use the finger technique. It is going to rain. For those of you who can't see me very well on the screen, I've got 5 fingers up and I'm going to squeeze the first 2 together. It's going to rain. Okay, those 2 fingers together are a visual way of telling our students this is a contraction. It's going to rain. It's going to rain. It's going to rain. Another thing that I can do to give a visual to the students that this word is stressed is by pounding the finger or squeezing the finger or waving the finger. In other words, visually, we can communicate to students something about the pronunciation without using a lot of blah, 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 teacher talk. Secondly, I do repetition, but with a little bit of drama. For example, your brother has headphones on. Say it loudly. It's going to rain. Or baby is asleep. Say it quietly. It's going to rain. We need rain. Say it happily. It's going to rain. We had plans for an outdoor wedding party. Say it angrily. It's going to rain. In other words, we've got students doing a lot of repetition. That's important. But there's an element of fun. There's something unexpected. And that means they will willingly repeat more. The next activity is a chant. The textbook has a short dialogue. The instructions say, work in pairs, read and act this dialogue, make up your own dialogue. You know what? My low-level students are very unlikely to do this on their own. They'll just sit there. So an alternative is to change it to a chant and do it as the whole class. What about watering the apple trees? All right. All right. What about watering the sweet potato field? All right. All right. You know, that rhythmic chant activity is important because English is a stress-timed language. The stress of the syllable determines the rhythm of the sentence. You know, we've got apple trees and we've got sweet potato field, you know, same rhythm, but the unstressed syllables are squeezed in there. If you do an internet search for jazz chant, you'll find lots of examples and videos and webinars. And if you're interested in this kind of activity, that will help you create them from the material in your own textbook. Well, when I do a jazz chant with low-level students, I try to remember to start slow. What about watering the apple trees? Okay, I snap or clap to show the rhythm. What about watering the sweet potato field? Sometimes we need to give our students help with a specific phrase, like, what about? You know, in my American dialogue, in my American dialect, I use kind of a flap sound. What about? In your dialect, it might be what about? But in any case, give the student some extra practice with that. Or a longer phrase like sweet potato field, sweet potato field. Then I can get faster. What about watering the apple trees? And then I can get the class to chant in parts, question and answer style. So, what about watering the sweet potato field? All right, all right. And finally, there might be time for additions. What about watering the chili pepper plants? What about watering the okra garden? Now, you see, even though the textbook started with apple trees, which are common in Tajikistan, I'm thinking, what's common in Ghana? Maybe not apple trees. Maybe I should have said plantain trees in the first place. So adapt the materials, same teaching point, slightly different vocabulary or content to your teaching content. I just want to add, you might think, oh, if I'm going to make these changes, why shouldn't I just make my own materials or use a different textbook? But sometimes we are required to use a certain textbook, or our students expect us to use the whole textbook. And a quick change enables us to meet that mandate and yet add that relevance to our students. Now, if you're doing a jazz chant, make sure that the rhythm stays the same. So I can do apple trees, plantain trees, but I can't do papaya tree, not in that particular rhythm. Here's another chant I created from some questions in the primary level book. Do you want to be a doctor? Yes, I do. Do you want to be a pilot? No, I don't. And again, you can find ready-made chants online, but I want to show you what to do when we have textbooks that we are required to use. Okay, now for the third activity. We see from this page that the textbook has food and meal-related vocabulary, adverbs of frequency like usually, always, often, and simple present. And it's in the form of a table. Students are supposed to make sentences from the table. And if your students don't like to do that kind of work on your own, you can certainly do a choral drill with the whole class, like porridge. We usually have porridge for breakfast. Potatoes, we usually have potatoes for breakfast. Rice, we usually have rice for breakfast, and so on with different patterns. But I want to talk about another technique that gives students more personalized practice, working in pairs, and because it uses cue cards, it's more fun than simply making sentences from the book. And you'll see it has some other advantages too. So first of all, we need vocabulary, and I can start with vocabulary from the book. I write them on the board, not every word from the book. You know, the book has sausages and steak, and, you know, I'm not going to put them up. These are the ones that I think are most relevant. And then I ask students for more related words. What are some words that they want to talk about? What are words that are important in their teaching context? Now, There are some meal-related words that they might not have learned. Some are translated and widely used in English, like kebab. Many English speakers would recognize. Maybe some who are pretty international would know what jollof rice is or red is, but if not, they might need to explain them. So I asked the students to check an online dictionary. Then they can see whether the word has been adapted into English or whether they need to explain the word. The last step is for students to choose from our list of words on the board 10. It's their choice, and they write them on cards or a little piece of paper. When students work in pairs, they will have a pile of 20 cards between them. Next step, I put the model dialogue on the board. Students work in pairs. Everyone is talking at once, and I am walking around the class listening to them. The students use their pile of cards to cue the sentences they make. For example, A picks a card from the pile, and it says, fufu. She says, have some fufu to her partner. And B answers, yes or no, thank you, yes, I like it, whatever, truthfully. Now it's B's turn to pick a card and ask A. She picks the card with coffee, and she says, have some coffee. A answers truthfully, thank you, or I'm sorry, or no, thank you, I don't drink coffee, whatever. Now, you can see that this is very similar to that choral drill. Have some, have some, have some, have some. But because students are working in pairs, they are more likely to be really speaking. It maximizes the amount of English students are using. Because the teacher and the students have selected relevant vocabulary, the practice is applicable to their lives. Because students can answer truthfully, the practice is more motivating. And because there are some variations possible in the answers, our low-level students can speak simply with thank you or I'm sorry. And our, pardon me, our higher level students can add to the exchange. I prefer scrambled eggs. I'm sorry, I'd rather have tea or coffee with milk and sugar, whatever. Now, the cards have been made. I want to use them again, this time to practice different sentence structures and a slight variation. Here's an example with he or she. It's kind of a difficult aspect of English that our students might be required to learn. So I put the model and the picture or the name, if you don't have pictures, on the board. So he usually has whatever food for breakfast or in the evening, whatever. Again, that is the pattern that was required of us from the book. The students practice from their pile of cards, but this time, instead of answering truthfully about themselves, they answer what they imagine. Here's Asamoah Gyan, the famous football player. So again, student A picks the card T. I wonder, yeah, he usually has tea for breakfast. Then it's B's turn. Cake. I wonder, he usually doesn't have cake in the afternoon. Now, low-level students will make sentences from the model, and more advanced students might add something like, what do you he doesn't have cake in the afternoon. He plays football all day. He eats cake whenever he wants to, or whatever. Now, I want to be ready with 3 to 5 different photos. So as I'm walking around the room, if I think that most of the pairs have gone through at least half of their cards, it's time to put up a new picture or a new name on the board. And students again shuffle their cards, they start again, it's the next round, and they can talk about a new person and what they imagine this person to eat or drink. Again, practicing the pattern from the textbook, but in a more current, relevant way for our students. Now, if you have really low-level students, make the model simpler. For example, simply practice, she usually has blank in the morning, afternoon, or evening. Lessen the number of choices if you have students at a lower level. Okay, time for another activity. This one is called Change the Ending. This activity can use fill in the blanks or gap fills and tables from the textbook. So here our textbook is expecting that students will make sentences such as, I heard the actor talk to the postman, or Kareem heard the boy sing a new song. You know, those are the kind of silly sentences that students will probably forget. They just are not meaningful enough to stick in the students' minds. So I want to show you how to personalize and localize the practice and give students more oral practice, more speaking. I keep the target grammatical form. In this case, it's complex objects. But I brainstorm with students about who they might hear and what they might hear. I write their ideas on the board. Now, sometimes the students come up with a word like joke, and they don't know the correct collocation. They don't know the verb or the object needed for that sentence pattern. So this is a good way for me to fill that in. Then I provide a model sentence and an example. Okay, these are the sentences we're going to be making. Depending on the class level, I may give students a chance to try making up sentences in small groups in advance. Or maybe I just call on them to say a sentence. So, I call on a student and they look at the phrases on the board, they look at the model, I heard the cat give a speech, I heard our neighbor, whatever. But here is the element of fun. The class votes on the sentence. A student says, I heard our neighbor yell at the kids. Very likely. I heard a cat tell a joke. Impossible. Okay, so that voting makes this more fun than simply practice the sentences in English. After the students are comfortable with the sentence pattern, cover up the options on the board and ask students to change the ending, making up their own. And this time, in addition to voting on whether the scenario is likely or impossible, they can also give feedback on whether the sentence is correct English. For example, I heard Kwame to speak Chinese. Possible? Yes. Grammar? No, it's got a mistake. It should be, I heard Kwame speak Chinese. 2. Here's an example of change the ending from a textbook for younger learners. Yeah, when we do it as is in the textbook, the students are getting to practice the verb be, but it feels artificial and boring. The duck is yellow. Is the duck yellow? The monkeys are funny. Are the monkeys funny? That means that the students will turn off their minds. The English won't soak in. The time will be wasted. So my first step is to add a few more adjectives. Not too many. We don't want to overload the students, just enough to make the activity fun. This can be a good time to review previous vocabulary or add a word you think the students will really enjoy. Next, the teacher cues a sentence beginning. So, the duck calls on a student and lets the student finish however they want to. Is the duck big? Is the duck scary? Is the duck nice? Whatever they want. Then the teacher calls on another student to answer, to respond. For example, is the duck scary? Yes, it's very, very big. Or is the duck scary? No, it's a duck. Ducks are not scary. Next student is cued monkeys. Are the monkeys yellow? Another student responds, no, the monkeys are brown. Elephant. Is the elephant little? Yes, it's a baby elephant. So you can see that several elements have been added to this practice. One is a kind of creativity as students use their imagination. Another is an element of fun as students compete to make outlandish questions. And there's a conversational element as the second student is asked to respond. Okay, our last activity of the day is readers' theater. This is an activity to do with stories or texts in our textbook. Our book has kind of a boring text about rubber. And the usual practice that teachers might engage in is to ask students to take turns reading aloud, sentence by sentence. But that's not really an effective strategy. It lets the good students show off, but the lower level students typically dread it and they do very poorly. So it doesn't really serve to improve any student's reading skills. Readers' theater is a way to turn ordinary prose into a dramatic skit. It does take a bit of time, so you probably can't do it every day, but occasionally I think it's worth it. The parts are assigned to different students. And you can see from the examples later on that they highlight natural sentence divisions. They highlight sense and meaning, and they let students take turns doing dialogue, if there is any, in the text. This leads to better reading comprehension and more speaking fluency. Okay, here's an example. This is what I did with that text about rubber. And I did it for a group of 4 students. So you can see 4 different colors. Now, if I had a large class, I would divide the class into groups of 4 so everybody can practice at the same time. Now, notice that some students are saying a full sentence. We all know what rubber is. But the next one is divided between 2 students. One says, we have seen it. The next says, on the wheels of cars. So they have to be encouraged to speak it together. We have seen it on the wheels of cars. Okay? But we have seen it is a key part of the sentence in terms of grammar. On the wheels of cars is the prepositional phrase, so it kind of highlights that bit of English. Subject and verb, moderators, prepositional phrases. The other thing is that I like students to be dramatic and emphatic, for example. But as soon as we stop pressing, the rubber springs back to its first shape. If we have really high-level students, they might create a draft of this reader's theater themselves. Now, again, it's kind of boring, but if we are required to use the textbook, if we have no other materials, turning a text into reader's theater can make it more engaging for students. Okay, here's another example. This one is for younger learners. Again, I've written it in 4 parts, but maybe you want 1 student per 1 line. And if you think about your multi-level class, maybe you could assign parts that are easier, like the red part, beep, beep, beep. You could assign that to a lower level student. I want to coach my students with instructions like, be ready with your line, especially if you're finishing up a sentence, like, he sees 3 little yellow chickens, okay? Be ready, you 2 students. And I want to tell the students again to be dramatic. Okay, was there a problem with the muting? I just want to make sure everything is okay.
It's okay now, ma'am.
Okay, good.
It's okay now.
All right. So I tell the students to be dramatic, like, oh, you are afraid, say, or runs and jumps. Let's linger on that spot, runs and jumps, or let's be emphatic. But the chickens don't want to play. Okay, encourage the budding dramatists and actors in your class. If you have an advanced student, you might want to assign that person to be a coach in each group, particularly if you have a large class and lots of different students in each group all practicing at once. And if you have time, let the students practice, give them feedback, let them practice some more, and then let them perform. If you are interested in readers' theater, here are some websites that will give you more information about it. Okay, we have looked at these 5 activities to get students speaking. If we are forced to use traditional textbooks, we can find materials in them which can be adapted. And we can also write newer versions of these activities too. As I mentioned, there are some benefits of these activities. They scaffold the learning for students, providing frames, examples, and structure. Students are not thrown in the deep end of speaking English without any vocabulary or grammar. The students are not using every bit of English on the dense pages in these textbooks, but they are using key pieces. That means that students will improve their accuracy and fluency. They'll make fewer mistakes. They'll have opportunities to repeat the target language. They'll get more comfortable with what's coming out of their mouths. We've made a few changes in the materials, and that means that learning is personalized. So instead of foreign characters or situations, students can talk about their own lives. That's important for daily motivation. and it's important for lifelong language acquisition. It's important to help students realize that English truly is a language for everybody, no matter where they are in the world. And finally, many of the activities are fun. Even beginners can appreciate the humor in a funny sentence, or can appreciate the game-like element, like, oh, we're picking cards. What will my card say? And that means that students will remember more of the English they are studying. I want to acknowledge Penny You might be familiar with the name of this great teacher, trainer, author. She has written many books that have inspired me, and she did a webinar for teacher development webinars, and that inspired me to get started on this topic. I do enjoy keeping in touch with teachers, and you can find my professional Facebook page, TESOL Trainer, and my email address. And now I believe it's time for you to ask your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my page, and let's get back to face-to-face, Zoom face-to-face.
Thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was lovely.
Okay, go on.
Yes. We have our first question from the chat room. Nida Ganem wants to know, what is more important? Is it accuracy or fluency?
I love that question. The first answer that comes to my mind is both are important. But I can also think of some situations where one might be important than other, and it depends on your students. For example, here in the United States, I've had some students who immigrated to the US, never had a chance to study English, work in an English-speaking environment, and just picked up the language from their workmates. They can communicate pretty fluently, but their English is full of mistakes. It is really inaccurate. And if those people ever wanted to go into higher education, if they wanted to study, they would need to work on accuracy. But I have also had students, particularly in Asia, I must say, who have done very well at studying textbook English. And they can do really outstanding work in exams. Their English is accurate, but they are so nervous when it comes to speaking, and they hesitate, they are not fluent at all. Those students might need to work on fluency, not accuracy. So let's say the answer to that question is usually fluency and accuracy are both important. But with some students, you might prioritize one over the other. And I want to add one more component, and that is depth. Fluency, accuracy, and depth. Depth means that we are expanding our repertoire of English. We're learning to talk about new subjects. Wow, I'm pretty good at everyday English, but I don't know how to talk about religion in English. Or, oh, I'm going into the field of education, and now I need to learn about all of these theories. I need to go into depth in a new area of English. That can also be important in our teaching.
Thank you very much, Doc. Thank you very much. Yes. Let's see.
I think there is another question from Noshin Hassan. Oh, okay. Please go on. It's not
Okay,
related.
thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Jacob Masu remarks that the Reader's Theater appears very poetic and dramatic. Yes, that's true.
It is, and I hope that your students will see it not just as reading, but as a chance to have fun, to be dramatic, and do something a little bit different with the text.
Okay.
Sometimes we think, oh, theater has to be, person A says this, person B responds, a kind of dialogue. But the word reader in front of that theater, reader's theater, reminds us that we can do it with narrative texts as well as conversational texts.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Mr. Anobiga Emmanuel. Which activity is best when you realize that the learner's native language has negatively affected his reading ability?
In other words, they are perhaps reading a word with the wrong pronunciation because of their native language. The spelling of English is confusing. Maybe they've, instead of saying president, as pronounced in American English, they might say président because their native language is French. Is that the kind of problem that you're imagining?
I believe so, because he's talking about negatively affecting the reading ability. So I'm sure it has to do with the pronunciation.
Right. So first of all, reading ability has a lot of components. So the reading ability might be reading aloud, which is related to pronunciation, but it also might be reading comprehension. So there's kind of a lot of factors when we say reading ability. But I would say if you're worried about your students' reading, it could be good to provide a model in advance. So for readers' theater, maybe I would go back to my text. Let's just do the one about, chicken. So let me see if I can find that. Spot sees 3 little yellow chickens. He wants to play with them. I would read it first in a dramatic way. Depending on your technology, you can make a recording and put it on your course management system, or you can ask your students to take out their phones and record you speaking it. Just provide some model with the correct pronunciation, intonation, expressiveness. Providing a model for students is one way to overcome that negative influence of their native language. But of course, you also want to make sure that students understand what they're reading. And I'm sure that you as teachers are used to that. Checking students' comprehension is something that most teachers learn very early on in their career.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Mr. Jacob Masub asks again, is there any difference between dialogue and the reader's theater activity?
Well, as I said, a dialogue is typically with a conversation. So we have maybe 2 or 3 characters, and they are talking back and forth. And with readers' theater, you are taking a narrative text and dividing it into parts. But it's like a dialogue in that the students in your class are speaking parts, but the source is different.
Okay, all right, thank you. Mr. Joseph Yaukan, these strategies are supposed to be fun and should whip up the student interest to learn. But there is a trend in our senior high schools today where most students are not just interested in learning anything, whether speaking, writing, or reading. What do you advise should be done, Prof?
Oh, it's really a pity. The students just sit there, don't they? They don't care. They
It
don't want to
happens.
learn. Yeah. You know, maybe we should do a whole other presentation on engaging students,
Okay.
because I think this is a really big topic, and I don't know if I can deal with it in just a few minutes to answer this question. But in general, I would say when we require students to be active, they are more likely to sit up, pay attention, and do something. So if as a teacher, I'm just talking, my students will put down their head, they'll sleep, they'll turn around, they'll look at their phone, whatever. But if I'm saying, you're in pairs, pick up your card, ask each other, and then I walk around the room, if my students are not picking a card, if they're not talking to each other, even if my class is really big, I have a chance to walk around and say, hey, I want to hear you. Pick a card, say it again, pick a card. And that kind of active activity will help engage even the most reluctant students. Not always, of course, but in general. So movement, engagement, work in pairs and small groups, those help students participate a little bit more. But again, I know that there are many more problems, and let's wait for another presentation to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. Miss Eunice wants to know if these activities could be useful for senior high school students.
Yes, indeed. And I hope that you saw that I gave examples from both a primary book and a secondary book. And I know that sometimes it's not easy to adapt an activity that you have heard about in a presentation to your particular book, but I would encourage you to do so.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Isa Mustafa, is it acceptable to blend both English and the learner's mother tongue language in these activities?
I'm glad you brought that up, because as I was thinking about, remember the activity where the students were making sentences like, she usually has rice for dinner. And I suggested that the students create with the teacher, create a list of vocabulary on the board for that. I think that's a really ideal time to use the student's mother tongue. So for example, you can give your instructions in the mother tongue. You can say in the student's mother tongue, here are 5 words from the book. Now let's get 5 more words that in English. Those instructions, it's fine to give them in the mother tongue. And then particularly when you're talking about the local foods, how can you explain red? You've got to use the student's mother tongue to do so. So yes, but then when it's time for the students to practice the sentences, that's when they should be using English. So he usually has red in the evening. Yeah, that's got to be English. And you want to have as much time for the students to be using English as possible. Our
Okay,
students are probably not going to be using English outside of class. So let's maximize the time in the class.
Yes, they are very comfortable using the mother tongue outside the classroom. So at least whilst they are in the classroom, that is when we have the opportunity to improve their English language. So that's true.
That's right.
Thank you. Miss Angelina wants to know, what about if there aren't enough textbooks available? How do you go about such activities?
Well, I think that is another really typical problem in many parts of the world. And I hope you can see that a lot of my activities use the board. So let's say, for example, The textbook has that 4-line dialogue of what about watering the apple trees? And you do not have to have a textbook for every person in the class. You can hold up the textbook and say, this is the dialogue from our textbook. We're going to practice it. And you write it on the board. But because you've only chosen 2 lines instead of 4 lines, there's less to write on the board. You can do it more quickly. Your students can copy the lines more quickly. The same thing is true for readers' theater. It can easily go on the board, and then you can highlight either with colored marker or with letters like A, B, C, D, who is going to be saying what. I hope you can see that these activities are easily adapted to classes where students do not have a book for every student. If you don't have a board, that's another problem. And again, maybe we can have another session on teaching in really difficult circumstances.
Yes, that's true. Mr. Alexander Kwashi wants to know, for such low-level learners, is there a place for silent reading?
Oh, I think there's a place for silent reading with every level of learners. I really appreciate silent reading. I think it is helpful for beginners, intermediates, and advanced. I think silent reading works best when students have had a little instruction in how to do it. So, for example, you might say, we are beginning our silent reading time today. We're going to spend 5 minutes doing it. If you are at my advanced level, I think you can cover 2 pages. If you are in my beginning level, please look over the page and see if you can find 5 words that you know. Circle those words with a pencil. Just something like that. So everybody in your class has a target that is at the right level for them. Another practice that is widely used is pair reading, so students can read to each other. So you might say, after our 5 minutes of silent reading, we'll do 3 minutes of pair reading. Be ready.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Miss Caroline wants to know, should a teacher focus on sounding native? And what should a teacher do when his students think sounding native is paramount to English language learning?
Another excellent question in today's global world. You know, the first thing that I would do is give my students examples of famous people around the world who speak English in different accents. You know, here's the Secretary General of the United Nations. Here's a famous soccer player, whatever. Listen to them speak English and give examples of Nigerian English, Ghanaian English, Singaporean English, Australian English, whatever. And then say, what does it mean to sound native? Native is an old-fashioned concept. It is not valid anymore because English belongs to the whole world. Instead, I want to focus on being comprehensible. I want to focus on making sure you speak English in a way that doesn't make your listener exhausted. I want to make sure you're speaking English so that someone from China can understand you, someone from Germany can understand you, someone from the United States can understand you. You know, I would do a little lesson. on English as a world language. And I hope that that will build up the teacher's confidence that his or her English is valid, important, and a gift to their students. And I hope it will take the edge off of the students' complaints, like, why don't you speak English? But I do think that everybody who speaks English might need to make a few adjustments in how they speak to be more comprehensible. For example, as an American, you know what, we have a lot of idioms that are very US centric, like, wow, he really hit it out of the ballpark, meaning he was excellent. Well, hit it out of the ballpark is a baseball idiom that is really local to the United States. So when I'm speaking to an international audience, I want to make sure I'm not using those kind of crazy idioms. Maybe I want to slow down a little bit. So I'm making adjustments, even though I am a native speaker of English. And maybe a teacher might say, you know, the way I pronounce this word, the stress is on a syllable that makes it hard for some people to understand me. Let me use an online dictionary with good pronunciation models and see if I can change my pronunciation a bit. So let's aim for comprehensibility, whether we are teachers or students.
Okay, thank you. We have one question from Noshin Ashan. How do we decide how much of the native language can be used in class?
Well, since this is the second question on that topic, I think it's really something that is on teachers' minds, isn't it? I don't know if this is possible for you, but my suggestion is that you record yourself teaching class. Let's do a little bit of research here, okay? Teacher research. So record yourself speaking class, then listen again, and just kind of count up minutes speaking the local language and minutes speaking the target language or English. Depending on the class, there might be a reason to do a little bit more of the target. You know, are you teaching speaking, reading, listening, or writing, whatever? But in general, as I said before, our students don't have an opportunity to use very much English outside of class. So we want to make sure that we have more English. So as you do your research, you might say, you know, wow, we had a 45-minute class and only 5 minutes with English. No, we need more. Okay, how can we up it? The other thing you can do in your research is to find out what the native language is used for. Is it used to discipline or engage in classroom management? Is it used in small talk, you know, just building rapport with students? Is it used to explain? Is it used to give instructions? And for each of those purposes, you might say, how can I make more English possible in this situation? For example, if you're giving instructions and you're using the native language to make the instructions clear, maybe you could say, if I did more demonstration, showing the teachers what to do, I could make it clear without using native language. Or if I'm joking around, you know what? I want my students to learn how to joke around in English. We can do that in English, not just our native language. So the purpose of the L1, the first language, and the amount of the first language should be part of your research. And I hope you can figure out ways to gradually add more and more English to the classroom without stressing your students out, so that their acquisition of English is enhanced.
Thank you very much. Let me check if we have any other questions. Well.
Miss Doreen, I would like to chip in that the attendance form, the link for the attendance form has been put in the chat box. So if anyone is still looking for the attendance form, please kindly go to the chat box and you get it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Equia. Yes. Let me see if we have any other questions. Okay. Well, everyone is happy. Everyone appreciates the presentation, beautiful response, and the responses to the question. They were all right on point. Thank you so much, Doc. Yes.
Well, I want to thank you. You were a really engaged audience. I loved your questions, and I feel it is a real privilege to reach out across the world by talking to teachers like you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor. Director, Mr. Akins.
Thank you, Dr. Kitty, for that insightful presentation. We are so glad, we are so privileged to have you with us. It's been an awesome session. Thank you for those wonderful insights that you've shared with us. Before we go, permit me to share my screen once again. All right, so let me share my screen. There we go. Okay. Yes, so it's been an awesome session. This 13th international webinar with Dr. Kitty Ferguson from Biola University, and then our awesome moderators, Ms. Doreen Delagado and Ms. Equia Aminiampon. We are so grateful for your wonderful work, Lieutenant. Thank you. All right, and so we have this certificate of recognition going to Dr. Kitty Ferguson for her invaluable service rendered as the resource speaker of our webinar entitled Helping Low-Level Students Speak by Adapting Traditional Textbook Exercises, awarded this first day of April 2023 via Zoom. And this certificate is duly signed by Dr. Neil Aribalo Alcantara, President of IELTS International, Dr. Glenn Parilla Cortizano, Academic Director of IELTS International, Ms. Fati Isifu, President of IELTS Ghana, Mr. Jacob, Vice President of IELTS Ghana, Mr. Alfred Kwetu, the Academic Director, and yours truly, Ebenezer. Thank you so much, Dr. Kitty. We are so privileged to have you with us.
You're very welcome.
Okay, and we have another certificate of appreciation going to Ms. Doreen Delagado in recognition of her invaluable service rendered as moderator of the webinar entitled Helping Low-Level Students Speak by Adapting Traditional Textbook Exercises, presented by Dr. Kitty Ferguson, Professor Emerita of TESOL at Biola University in the USA, awarded this first day of April 2023 via Zoom. Thank you, Ms. Doreen.
Thank you, Director.
All right, we have the last one before we go. Certificate of appreciation going to Ms. Equia Aminiampon in recognition of her invaluable service rendered as moderator of the webinar entitled Helping Low-Level Students Speak by Adapting Traditional Textbook Exercises, presented by Dr. Kitty Ferguson, Professor Emerita of TESOL at Biola University in the USA. Thank you so much, Ms. Equia.
Thank you so much, Director. I really appreciate it.
And to our dear participants, I believe we've all filled out the evaluation form, which has been shared in the chat box. So we are going to award these certificates of participation to all those who have filled out the evaluation form. And we have the certificate here, your name, and it's also signed by Dr. Neil, Dr. Glenn, Ms. Fati, Mr. Jacob, Mr. Alfred, and by my oneself. Thank you all for coming. All right, let me stop sharing and hand over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's been an honor moderating the session, and it's a pleasure learning from you, Dr. Kitty. And it was lovely having all our participants here with us, contributing, asking their questions. Without them, this session wouldn't have been fun. We would like to say that next time when we organize, we would invite all of you, and we hope you come and we all learn together. Thank you very much, and we wish everybody the best. Thank you, Dr. Kitty.
Thank you.